From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson with you. And ahead today, out of the Livestock Marketing Information Center, Jim Robb will offer up this week's cattle market insight. He'll comment on the just reported beef export numbers for August, and Jim will talk about the good economic prospects for wheat grazing in the Central Plains this fall. Also highlights from this week's Cattle Chat podcast from the Beef Cattle Institute at K-State, this time focusing on testing forages for nutrient content and whether or not it's worth the time and expense to have forage analyzed. K-State's Brad White, Bob Larson, and Bob Weaber will tackle that question. Further ahead, Jeff Wickman has this week's Forage segment as he talks with K-State's Amy Sollock about the 48 hours of forage activities this weekend. It's all here on Agriculture Today.
Hamburgers, roast, ribs, steak, or whatever you prefer. Beef, it's what's for dinner. Kansas cattle farmers produce 7.5 million head of cattle per year. It takes about 7 tablespoons of peanut butter to get the same amount of protein in 1 serving of lean beef. Support your local Kansas farmers and ranchers. Eat beef. This message was brought to you by the K-State Animal Sciences Leadership Academy participants.
You're tuned in to the K-State Radio Network, and glad to have you aboard once more for Agriculture Today. As we typically do on a Monday, we'll get right into the cattle market scene and talk with the director of the Livestock Marketing Information Center based in Denver, Jim Robb. Jim, we've a smorgasbord of things that we'll get into today, but first we'll start with a look back at the trade from last week. The fed cattle market was, slightly higher at week's end, but really not a whole lot new to see here overall.
Fed cattle market, fairly flat the last 3 weeks or so, Eric. We had slaughter of cattle last week up 1.1% year over year, and actually hog slaughter down slightly year over year. Box beef cutout was slightly weaker over the wholesale beef market, down about 77 cents. It's still holding above $2 a pound or $200 a hundredweight. But the fed cattle market kind of moving sideways here. Wholesale market down a little bit, and feeder cattle markets, calves and yearlings, up a little bit in most areas of the U.S. In fact, in some of these early wean calves that are in pretty good shape, brought $1 to $5 a hundredweight above what they did the prior week. So there is some support, it appears, in the calf and yearling marketplace.
On that latter score, what is at the root of that support for calf prices, do you think?
Well, I think we have very good pasture and range conditions and actually improving conditions, and so potential for winter wheat grazing, and also, apparently pretty strong interest coming from feedlots trying to still find heavyweight feeder cattle. So I think those have all come together and kind of buffered this market as we seasonally move into our larger runs coming off ranches of calves.
Well, among the things we wanted to get into this time around, the latest beef export numbers out of the U.S. for the month of August. And you describe these as stellar, these numbers.
Well, we've been on a very good string, especially in the beef complex. And looking at the preliminary numbers that came out last Friday for the month of August, our product weight, now we're waiting for the rest of the USDA calculations, but the overall product weight exports for the month were up 7% year over year. And the value was up 11% year over year. And if we step back and look at year-to-date in the beef complex, product weight exports are up about 9%. The value's up about 19% year-to-date, Eric. So this has been a very important component of the demand complex and supportive of cattle prices. And just to give a bit of a contrast there, the pork exports for the month on a product weight basis were down 1%. And down 3% on a value basis. So we really have the beef complex contributing to our overall export profile very strongly. And it's strong within the ag complex. Beef is kind of leading the way, and then ag complex overall is kind of leading the nation in terms of the export profile.
There does not seem to be any sign out there of our export business slowing to any dramatic extent. Or are you seeing anything to that effect?
Well, we expected, the year-over-year increases to start to moderate because we're now comparing against strong numbers a year ago. So we're, comparing against the peak months in 2017. And I think your point is well taken, Eric. We look at this price. So we sold more quantity in the export markets in recent months, and we sold it at higher prices. Now, domestic prices have been higher too, but that's a good omen in terms of the demand profile when you can sell more at higher prices, and that's exactly what's happened in recent months and continued in the latest data, which was for August.
Great news, which is continuing to underpin the cattle market. You have some numbers, actually production projections, for meat and poultry output out of the U.S. in the year 2019. You might share those, Jim.
Well, we often talk about beyond the beef complex, what the competing meats are doing and kind of what the overall profile is for the sector in terms of production. We've talked about the strong export demand, and taking a quick look at production here in 2018, beef production in our forecast for the year will be up about 3% year over year, pork production up about 4%, and chicken production up about 3%. So those are actually a little more modest rate of growth than we had in 2015, 2016, 2017, but still rather large growth rates where, again, the export markets have been key to that demand component, along with the domestic consumer. Then we look ahead to 2019 in our forecast, and I think the bottom line is still growing in terms of beef production, but importantly in terms of the competing red meats and chicken and turkey production. Beef production in 19 probably will be up on the order of 2% year over year, with pork production also up about 2%. And then we have chicken production also up about 2%. So those are still growing in terms of competing meat supplies, but at a more modest pace, Eric, and I think that's one of the keys here, that the big ramp up in terms of the supply side year over year is starting to wind down a little bit. Still growing, and we still have these larger supplies ahead, but maybe on a year-over-year basis a little more manageable when we get into 2019, which does sort of bode well. Now, underpinning these pullbacks in production, especially on the pork and chicken side, is profitability of producers. Just to give you a flavor here, in the wholesale chicken complex, if we look across all the parts of chicken in the wholesale marketplace, last week, all those key components were down over 20% in terms of prices year over year. And hog prices are also been struggling, especially back in August. They've rebounded some here. But the beef sector has held together very well in terms of these very large supplies. Most of the adjustment, and we have to not only quantity, but the prices that it took to move this in the marketplace have been dramatically lower, especially in the chicken complex.
But for beef's part, it's incumbent upon the sector to keep that demand up, even with these slowing rates of growth in production expected to come on here in 2019.
We do, Eric, and we have to remember that we're building on record large pork production in 2018. We're going to have larger production in 2019 and record large chicken production in 2018 and building on that in 2019. So these are levels that are need to be dealt with, and how the price profile can hold up in face of those supplies is really the key to the marketplace overall.
Do want to flip back to something that you mentioned just a moment ago and maybe outline it further, and that is the prospect for wheat grazing in the Central Plains. Right now, as it's shaping up with moisture being replenished in so many parts of the Central Plains, these opportunities for grazing at a reasonable return seem to be improving.
Certainly the potential here for small grain grazing across the Southern Plains is much improved compared to last year. In some areas, actually, Eric, we probably had a little bit too much moisture, which we don't often say in the Southern Plains. But we look back at how many cattle have been on these small grain pastures, and USDA developed a survey several years ago. As of January 1, they put out these numbers, and we've had a very wide range in terms of cattle on those programs. We've had a high in the last several years of about 3.7 million head and a low of about 1.5 million head. So in some years, we really doubled the number of cattle on wheat pasture. And the low was posted last year on January 1, 2018. We're expecting a strong rebound in the numbers of animals that are going to be on wheat pasture. As we described, the conditions are quite good, and as you mentioned, Eric, the economic conditions look fairly favorable also. And so we expect a strong rebound in the number of head that are on these wheat pastures this year. And that's where a lot of the competition. We have both feedlots and grazing programs. We think, it looks like in the price profile, already starting to bid for some of these animals going to either one of those types of production systems, and quite a bit of competition. So that bodes well, especially for lightweight calf prices here in the next couple months. And with the low corn market also, this dimension of the feedstuff costs and the cost of gain is really important to buffering the seasonal decline in calf prices as we move over the next month or two. And maybe these wheat pastures will have more cattle on wheat pastures, but also earlier than we've had in recent years. So that sets the stage for some of the recent strength, especially in these lightweight calf prices across the Southern Plains.
So if we had a producer out there on the fence as to whether to turn calves out on wheat pasture, the numbers would say most assuredly look at that very hard and maybe lean in that direction.
I think so, Eric, and I think also we need to recognize that across the futures market last week, the feeder cattle contracts, we look at the March contract, and all of the feeder cattle contracts set new contract highs last week. So we're looking at a March contract of $154 and change. That was up nearly $1.75 for the week on the weekly average basis. And so we probably also ought to look at, if we're going to go into those programs, at locking in some of this profit potential, because as we know, these marketplaces tend to go up and down, and the futures market has been fairly optimistic on the potential of those animals and what weight they might be coming off these grazing programs. I think we need to take a hard look at that side also.
As a matter of fact, there are a couple of articles on wheat grazing potential in the Central Plains on the lmic.info website out of the center. You might have a look, lmic.info. As always, Jim, we appreciate your time and your input, and we'll catch up with you again quite soon. Thank you.
It's been my pleasure, Eric.
He directs the Livestock Marketing Information Center, does Jim Robb, and Jim's afforded us his thoughts on the cattle trading trends on this Agriculture Today.
What is radon? Home exposure to radon gas is the leading cause of lung cancer death in the United States for non-smokers. In Kansas, 1 in 4 homes will test at or above the EPA action level. The Surgeon General recommends all homes be tested and fixed if necessary. Visit kansasradonprogram.org for more information. Test, fix, save a life. This message brought to you by the Kansas Radon Program, the Kansas Association of Broadcasters, and this station.
This is Agriculture Today. You'll recall last Thursday we talked with K-State agronomist Jeannie Falk-Jones about testing harvested forages for cattle feeding this fall and winter. A large number of producers have been inquiring about that of late, we're told. And the topic has drawn the attention of the Beef Cattle Institute team here at K-State. As during this week's BCI Cattle Chat podcast, veterinarians Bob Larson and Brad White and cow-calf specialist Bob Weaber weigh in further on forage testing. Here's Brad.
So we put out some polls, and I wanted to say I really appreciate everybody that responded to the poll. We had great response on both Facebook and Twitter. One of the interesting things that we found was, from the poll results, we asked, do you test your forages going into the winter season? And on Facebook, 76% of the people said, yes, we test our forages. On Twitter, 26% of the people said yes. So it was just opposite between the two platforms, kind of like what you guys were saying, whether or not you should test your forages. So I'm going to open up with kind of where we left off last week. Should you test your forages coming in? And Bob Weber, I'm going to start with you.
Yeah, so I'm kind of a proponent of doing it mostly because I'm kind of tight and I don't like to spend money where I don't need to. But hay testing to me is one where I can get that $20 or $30 or $40 of sampling costs back, depending on what my supplementation strategy is going to be. And there's, I think, some real value in knowing what you've got as a forage resource going into winter and getting it in time that you can do some strategic purchasing of particularly protein supplements that you might use. I also kind of like sort of the mid-range samplings because in terms of product, because you get calcium and phosphorus as part of that. And
what do you mean mid-range sampling?
So in terms of price. So not the cheapest one, because then you just get dry matter and crude protein.
Yeah, that's what I was going to ask you is what do you want from your forage analysis? What analyses do you want?
So I typically like sort of the dry matter, crude protein, calcium, phosphorus, and usually those packages come with some other stuff, but those are the main ones I'm after because in gestating cows, the things I'm going to have to supplement over winter are I need an energy source, so the hay. I got to provide a protein source or two to make sure we meet protein requirements, and then mineral supplementation is key. And if I'm going to feed some kind of distiller's product, for example, I may be able to back off substantially, particularly the phosphorus content in that mineral supplement. So I save money on so I don't over supplement on the mineral side.
So when you're talking about mid-range and price, can you ballpark that for me, knowing that there's range?
Yeah, there's range in the marketplace, and we do some work through the analytic lab here at Animal Science, and that middle test costs $30 for a sample. And we can talk a little bit, if you want, about sampling strategies. Getting a good representative sample, plan on about $30. So
let me come back to sampling strategies. Bob Larson, tell me, do you want a hay test when you're going into fall?
So I'm going to answer yes and no, in that I do see the value of testing forages. I think some of the things that Bob Weaber said is exactly right. But then I'm also going to use some of my experience was when I was in veterinary practice, and I worked with some clients that were very interested in forage testing, and the client and I were climbing all over a hay barn, trying to get samples from different cuttings, different sources of hay, and working really hard to get a lot of different forage samples, doing it right, sending those in, and then you've got this analysis that gives me the numbers that I want, and I can plug it into my computer program. But what I really found was even when I did all of that work to get as accurate a forage analysis as I could get, I still needed to watch the cows, in that I couldn't just make a ration and forget about it over the wintertime, because it invariably I either overestimated or underestimated the nutrient content of the forage, and so I was going to need to make some adjustments anyway. So I still have to watch the cattle. I still have to be willing to change my mind. And so I would say that while forage testing is important, what I'm really looking for is, say I'm a producer or a veterinarian in a geographic area, is to get a really good feel for the forages in my area. So what do I typically mean by the nutrient content of the prairie hay or brome hay or whatever that I'm growing in my area? What do I mean by that? What's an average? What's a range? And then I kind of use those going forward, whether I absolutely test this group or not. So I'm going to say I see the value of forage testing, but it's not the end all. I need to work harder than just that to really manage winter cow costs.
And if you're not formulating a ration, if you're not going to use the information from the forage test, then it doesn't make sense to do that.
Well, that's true.
But you've got to come up with some sort of plan for putting it together. And whether you estimate, and you're saying you'd estimate based on book values, and Bob, you're saying really rather would have a more accurate estimate of the hay that I've got on hand than just looking at the book, because book values may not fit my area or this growing season or this particular batch of forage that I got. Is that what you're saying?
I think that's exactly right. There's enough variation that either to the good side or extreme to the bad side that knowing that average book values are just that. They're average book values, and in a typical growing season, they're probably reflective. But if you're going to go to the effort of testing, I sure think, going to the next step of, okay, let's put together a ration. And so I would, most of our extension agents around the state use brands, a ration balancing software. Put it in, and it'll go consult with your extension specialist, and they can put together a ration that's a least cost one using your forage test to tell you exactly what kind of supplements to sort of take out a little. Because I agree, Bob, you got to go look at the cows. And if you've used book values, it's even more important to go look at the cows and make adjustments in nutrient availability. Because for most producers in Kansas, the hay supply that we provide over the winter is supplement to some grazed forage that they're going to get. And if we're way off in terms of either forage availability or the quality of our standing dormant forage, then those kind of adjustments become really important to meet both energy and protein requirements for those cows.
And I would throw in, when you say look at the cows, I agree with both of you. I think that's critical, but it is very hard to see subtle changes over time. And the analogy that I've used is like you look at your kids. So we've got kids, all of us have kids, and as your kids grow, you don't see that on a daily basis. Where you see it is in pictures. So one of the things that I've talked about with producers is take a picture of the cows once a month. You can scroll back through them. You'll see the changes much easier than trying to watch body condition change day to day, because they can easily creep one direction. So if you take pictures over some interval, then you can see that change a little bit easier. The other area that I wanted to follow up on, how you talked about forage testing strategies. So we're saying, yes, there are times to test, and there may be times that you're okay going with book values if you're pretty sure what you're getting off there. And you have to decide what suits you and your operation. Either way, you want to make a ration. But if I'm going to test, how many bales should I test? What % of the forage should I test? Is it based on a per batch basis, per type of bale? What do you think?
Yeah, so great question, Brad. And I think if you go to I'll put a couple of links in the show notes that sort of outline that, because getting a representative sample turns out to be a bit more complicated than most people think. You can't
crawling around in a hay pile.
Crawling around in a hay pile, getting a random sample. Typically, the advice is about 20% of the hay lot, but not less than the number of bales sort of outlined. And depending on what the hay crop is, that can range from 3 or 4 bales in a grass hay crop, for example, from a single cutting in a single field. So getting the lot right, if you will, in terms of we might have alfalfa or prairie hay from 5 different places cut over a month of time. Those represent different hay lots, so we need to sample each of those. And the general advice is about 20 cores from a batch or a lot of hay. And so doing that randomly and getting it in the correct spot, depending on if you've got small square bales or big round bales or big square bales, making sure you get not on the end.
20 cores per batch, but then you would put all those cores in one container for one test. So when you said earlier like a $30 test, you'd take 20 cores, throw them all in a bag, and then send that in.
Yeah, and your target's about half a pound of hay to send to the lab, because they're going to have to grind it and handle it, and you don't want to send them 5 pounds of hay. They're going to look at you sideways.
And I would say, some of the things that you brought up make me think of some of the clients that I saw that really worked really hard on their forage management, both standing dormant forage and hay. And one of the things that they would do is, based on where they thought, based on timing, when do they harvest this hay, what is the grass, they would try to place them in storage, whether it's stored inside or outside, in ways that allowed them to get the hay they wanted. In other words, they wanted to use their higher quality hay for growing heifers, and they could use lower quality hay for dry cows, but you have to have them in a place where I can
barn in the right way.
I can actually get them that way. And so, again, putting some real thought into it. And I'm impressed, again, I'm thinking of some of my clients that really did a great job of thinking all the way through to how they were going to manage their forage, trying to get the most out of it.
So I think that, and absolutely, as you plan for the fall, and one of the things that we emphasized, come up with the ration. The second thing we emphasized is
you're still going to have to watch the cows.
Watch the cows. Next week, we're going to talk about growing heifers. So if I weaned my heifers this week, and I plan to keep them for breeding heifers, what should be my rate of gain, average daily gain for those heifers between now and April? We will discuss that next week on how we should plan that for the nutrition for the heifers. Thanks for joining us.
K-State's Brad White, Bob Weaber, and Bob Larson. This week on the podcast, they also got into the latest dialogue on cattle traceability. You can hear all that in its entirety at beefcattleinstitute.org. beefcattleinstitute.org. You're listening to Agriculture Today.
While many people know hunger is an issue in developing countries, it is also a problem in our own backyards. In 2010, 1 in 7 Kansans struggled to put adequate food on the table. 2 K-State research and extension programs are tackling this problem. The Family Nutrition Program and Expanded Food and Nutrition Education Program reach thousands of Kansans in more than 70 counties. They learn how to eat healthy with a low budget. For more information about these programs, visit ksre.ksu.edu.
This is Agriculture Today, broadcasting from the campus of Kansas State University. Eric Atkinson here. And now to today's agricultural news headlines, courtesy in part of DTN. U.S. agricultural exports in the month of August totaled just shy of $11 billion, that against imports of $10.3 billion for a monthly trade surplus of $619 million. The value of imports fell slightly more than the fall in the value of exports, resulting in the trade surplus edging up by $17 million compared to those of July. The export total of August at $10.98 billion, to be exact, the lowest mark of the fiscal year. This a year which included 2 months of $13 billion or more in exports, those being October and November. The U.S. agricultural trade surplus has been under $1 billion 6 months in this fiscal year 18, but so far has not registered a deficit. The last time the agricultural trade surplus was under $1 billion for 6 months was back in fiscal year 2015. The trade surplus was below $1 billion 5 months in each of fiscal years 16 and 17, including registering a trade deficit 1 month in each of those 2 fiscal years. Canadian dairy producers met with Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau last week in Montreal and expressed concern about the provisions in the U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement that grants the U.S. increased access to the Canadian dairy market. Comments from officials after the session indicate they remain concerned about the potential impacts to their industry, even as the Canadian government pledged to compensate farmers for their losses. Trudeau said he acknowledged dairy producer concerns and reiterated the government would, quote, work with them. Meantime, the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, in one of its headlines, noted that Canadian producers thought the deal overall was a win for 90% of Canadian agriculture, despite the dairy concessions. Another headline called the deal good news for wheat, beef, and pork producers, while bad for supply-managed sectors such as egg, poultry, and dairy. Farm groups showed their support for the deal, including the Canadian Pork Council and the Canadian Cattlemen's Association. One change in the agreement was affecting wheat trade, forcing Canada to grade imports of U.S. wheat in a manner no less favorable than it accords Canadian wheat, and to not require a country of origin statement on its quality grade or inspection certificate, as defined as a key achievement by the U.S. Trade Representative's Office. Now, those changes are to be in place for the harvest of 2019. Current policy forces Canadian buyers to grade and price U.S. wheat as feed quality, regardless of the actual quality. This move will be viewed as controversial by many of the prairie producers, although it was greeted with open arms by the Western Canadian Wheat Growers Association, which has been working for more than 2 years with the National Association of Wheat Growers and U.S. Wheat Associates on this issue. The USDA and the pork industry are ramping up plans and preparations to keep African swine fever out of this country, or to handle it quickly if it should somehow get in. Here's more from the USDA's Gary Crawford.
Agriculture Secretary Sonny Perdue's orders to the appropriate agencies in his department:
double down the guard to keep African swine fever out of the United States.
African swine fever, a virus of swine only, usually kills the animal. No treatment for it, no vaccine. Almost anything can spread it. It even can live in frozen meat products. China's been battling outbreaks for months now, and it's showing up in Europe. Perdue told North American meat industry representatives USDA has put restrictions on imports of swine and pork from China, is working with industry here to increase biosecurity, and if the disease still gets into the U.S.,
we're going to work immediately to contain and to stamp out this disease and to eliminate it quickly.
One key to that, early detection, rapid confirmation testing, and to that end,
we're working now to make sure that we've got adequate federal and state laboratory capacity to handle any of the testing needs that may occur.
So Perdue said in this case you have to
prepare for the worst and pray for the best, and that's what we're doing at USDA.
In Washington, Gary Crawford for the U.S. Department of Agriculture.
For this week's edition of Tree Tales, K-State Forester Jaron Tyndall awaits with the final segment of his series on watershed restoration. Jared?
Today's topic is streamside forest restoration. An important part of managing Kansas streams is managing streamside vegetation. This is especially true for our larger streams, which are rarely stable or healthy if not flanked by a forest plant community. While immediate restoration of degraded streams in Kansas is usually cost prohibitive, passive restoration projects centered on creating a healthy stream corridor can be a meaningful and much more cost-effective tactic. One objective of streamside forest restoration is to restore natural patterns of plant community distribution within the stream corridor. Rarely is it feasible to attempt to plant the full complement of appropriate species. Rather, the more typical approach is to plant the dominant species or those species unlikely to colonize the site on their own. For example, a common focus is on planting oaks. Oaks are heavy-seeded, are often shade intolerant, and may not be able to readily invade new sites for generations unless they are introduced in the initial planting plan, particularly if flooding has been reduced or curtailed. It is assumed that lighter-seeded and shade-tolerant species like hackberry will invade the site on their own and will ensure that the resulting forest is adequately diverse. This process can be accelerated by planting corridors of small-seeded, wind-distributed species such as cottonwoods across the restoration area to promote seed dispersal. Large-scale restoration work sometimes includes plantings of understory species like pawpaw, especially if needed for specific objectives such as wildlife habitat. However, it is often difficult to establish understory species, which are typically not tolerant of full sun, if the restoration area is open. Where understory species are unlikely to establish themselves for many years, they can be introduced in adjacent forested sites or planted after the initial tree plantings have matured. The rationale for favoring large-seeded trees has been to ensure that restored riparian and floodplain areas do not become completely dominated by opportunistic species like hackberry and elm, and that wildlife functions and timber values associated with the more valuable hardwood species will be present as soon as possible. It has been documented that heavy-seeded species may be slow to invade a site unless planted, but oaks are not the only species worth introducing. Most foresters agree that planting a wide variety of species is best for ensuring the long-term health and value of the streamside forest and therefore the stream itself. If you have stream erosion issues on your land and would like to know what can feasibly be done about it, I encourage you to give me a call. Also, mark your calendars for a free educational workshop to be held on January 15th in Seneca, Kansas, where you can learn more about stream management and connect with professionals in this field. To register, please visit the Delaware River Raps website. This has been Jaron Tyndall with the Kansas Forest Service, and you've been listening to another Tree Tale.
Thanks, Jaron. This is National 4-H Week, and Jeff Wickman and his guest will talk about that after this break. You're listening to Agriculture Today. Legal and financial concerns surround the day-to-day management of the agricultural industry. Producers, ag creditors, and USDA agencies rely on Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services. If you've received an adverse decision from the USDA or have an ag credit concern, call today 800-321-3276 or visit us online, Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services, exploring options, generating solutions.
Welcome back, and thanks for joining us on Agriculture Today over the K-State Radio Network. I'm Jeff Wickman. 4-H is the nation's largest youth development organization, empowering nearly 6 million young people across the U.S. and more than 75,000 in Kansas. A new 4-H year started this month, and this week is National 4-H Week. The theme, Inspire Kids to Do, is the campaign focus for the new 4-H year. Southwest Area 4-H Youth Development Specialist Amy Sollock says the theme really defines what 4-H is all about.
4-H was founded on the belief that when kids are empowered to pursue their passions, then their own unique skills grow and take shape, helping them to become leaders in their lives, communities, and eventually lifelong careers. So the whole idea or premise behind National 4-H Week is to inspire kids to do.
It's also an opportunity to raise awareness of 4-H.
Yeah, 4-H reaches nearly 75,000 young people across the state of Kansas. We're really proud of reaching that number of kids, and we want everybody to know about what a great organization we are, what our values are, how our kids benefit from belonging to a 4-H club.
Talk a little bit more about some of the benefits of belonging to a 4-H club.
Right, so we know through research that kids belonging in 4-H or having a 4-H experience are 4 times more likely to give back to their communities as adults. We know that they're 2 times more likely to make healthier choices in life and 2 times more likely to pursue opportunities in science, mathematics, engineering, and technology. And we believe that those things are things everybody wants for their children.
The leadership and just learning how to socialize and belong to a group is really important, especially at this age when kids are kind of starting to really think about what they want to be.
Yeah, one of the essential elements that we provide kids is with that sense of belonging. And so participating in a community 4-H club provides those kids with a chance to socialize, interact with kids their own age, older teens, form healthy relationships with caring adults, and that really fosters that sense of belonging. They feel a part of something bigger than themselves.
And this hands-on learning is really important for kids as well.
Yeah, that's really the cornerstone of the 4-H program. We believe in hands-on learning by doing, and we feel that that's the way children learn the best, especially when that learning process is fostered by an adult mentor or a volunteer that helps guide the child through the learning experience.
What are some things that are going on for National 4-H Week?
We have some really exciting days in the week to come. Tomorrow, Tuesday, is 4-H Spirit Day. So we're hoping that kids, 4-H members, parents, volunteers, 4-H alumni, and supporters all wear their green or a 4-H clover on Tuesday. Thursday is National Youth Science Day, and kids across Kansas will be participating in different STEM-related activities and experiments, maybe even in their schools. And the big event that we kind of lead up to all week long is what we call 48 Hours of 4-H. And it's a massive statewide effort to give back to communities. So kids across Kansas will be giving their time, their talents. They'll be rolling up their sleeves and giving their service back to their communities in a number of different ways.
Have you heard yet what some of the clubs are going to be doing?
We've got everything from community garden projects, community cleanup going on. We've got nursing home, long-term care, food drives, you name it. It's going to be happening.
And you'll probably have a chance to follow this because part of this whole process is getting the word out about what they're doing, so a lot of this will be done on social media.
Yeah, it's an intense 48 hours. We've asked all the kids to register their service projects on a website so we can sort of track the number of hours and the different types of service that they're giving. We're asking all the projects to document them and post them, share them on social media channels so that we can get the word out about what our kids are doing across the state.
You would also like to see maybe others participating in this, so part of this is also kind of built around the fact that you're going to invite others to take part in this 48 hours of 4-H?
Yeah, National 4-H Week is always the second full week in October, which is also the beginning of the 4-H year. Our 4-H year begins October 1. So it's an excellent opportunity for us to reach out and invite others to participate with us and learn what 4-H is all about. So we'll be asking friends, neighbors, businesses, new supporters, new sponsors to all participate with us and really learn what Kansas 4-H is all about. And we're about developing young people, helping them find their passion, and guiding them through a lifelong learning experience.
And we're always looking for more volunteers as well.
Absolutely, absolutely. We have a great volunteer base across the state. We couldn't do what we do without them. We have a good screening process where we train and register our adult volunteers, and we'd always love to hear when folks want to give their time in that capacity. In that case, we ask that you visit with your local K-State Research and Extension office, and your local agents can help sort of walk you through how to become a 4-H volunteer.
And there are also a number of clubs within each community, so sometimes it's worth visiting several clubs.
Yeah, to find the club that's right for you, your child, and your family. A lot of our units have multiple options in terms of which clubs to join. We also have different opportunities to participate in 4-H, whether that's in an after-school club, during the school day through school enrichment. We provide camping opportunities over the summer. So there's a number of ways to get your children involved in the 4-H program.
And as you mentioned, there are so many different subject areas that they can focus on throughout the year.
Yes, we have over 30 different 4-H project areas. Some that are focused on health and nutrition, some that are more focused in the creative arts, such as photography or painting. We have several science-related projects from agronomy to robotics. Of course, our more traditional agriculturally rooted projects, livestock. We have pets, There's literally something for every child.
And National 4-H Week is really a great way to kick off the new year.
Absolutely. We're really excited. Moving on into this new 4-H program year, we hope to reach more kids than ever before and really provide that deep quality experience that we're so well known for.
You mentioned contacting the Extension Office. They can also find a lot of information online.
Yes, they can. We ask that you visit kansas4h.org. That's kansas4-h.org. And we've got a variety of different ways to find your local office or find the clubs near you from that website.
And if people haven't nailed down a project for the 48 hours of 4-H, they've still got time.
Yeah, absolutely. So if you're part of the 4-H program already and you want to throw together a community service project this weekend, then get online, register your project, and share it on social media.
That's Southwest Area 4-H Youth Development Specialist Amy Sollock. Again, for more information, contact your local county or district extension office or visit kansas4h.org. And that'll do it for this edition of Agriculture Today. For Eric Atkinson, I'm Jeff Wickman. This is the K-State Radio Network.